All right, so today we are going to start the Civil War notes. And I wanted to start with going over some of these questions just because a lot of you had the same answers and some of them weren't quite correct. So I wanted to go over these. One and two, as long as you gave me realistic answers. A lot of you put armor or things like bombs or bulletproof vests, which are all fantastic ideas, but they didn't have any of that back then. I didn't mark you off for that because I didn't specify it had to be back then. Just so we're all on the same page. A lot of people missed this one. I think you saw textiles and went, "Oh, cotton, the South." But no, because the economy was based on manufacturing, it was actually the North. For these, a lot of the advantages the North had was population. They had more money. They had all the manufacturing and things like that because you need factories to make guns, weapons, ammo, tents, cloth, uniforms, yada, yada, yada. You need population because you need to have more troops. The South, which a lot of you actually picked up on, so I don't know if you Googled it or where, but you said that the South was fighting for their homes, that they were fighting for what they believed in. Or you said that one of the South's main advantage was that they knew the terrain, all of which are perfectly correct. Some of you mentioned their cash crops, which is true. They did have more agriculture, so a lot of you made that leap that, the South's known for agriculture, they would have more food, things like that. Uh, there are 11 states in the Confederacy, there are 20 states in the Union. Confederate states are all the ones in red here: Texas, Louisiana, um, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas. The Union states are all the ones in dark blue. I'm not going to go through all of them, but all the New England states: Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, New York, PA, Ohio, Kansas, Nevada, and all that, California. Now, the ones that I want to go over are the ones in light blue, these border states. So Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, which ended up becoming a state during the Civil War, Maryland, and then teeny tiny little Delaware. And what the border states are states that remained in the Union but still allowed slaves. Okay. So slavery was legal in Missouri, Kentucky, all these light blue states, but they didn't join the Confederacy. Oh, speaking of slaves, that reminds me of one other thing. A lot of you put for number two that one of the advantages the South had in winning the war were their slaves. Now, in some respects, that's correct because they would have had people to do some of the more menial tasks for them, do more cooking, more like the dirty work of military life, digging the trenches, setting up the tents, cooking, laundry, things like that. But some of you said that the South had the advantage because they would have more slaves to fight for them. And I didn't take off points, but something I really want you to understand is that there is no way slaveholders would have their slaves fight for them. Do you know why? Because if you were a slave owner back then, would you want to give your slave a rifle? I didn't think so. But anyway, let's start the notes. So, Civil War 2020, these are adapted. Now, believe it or not, this is actually less than I usually do for the Civil War. This is a gigantic unit, so bear with me. Um, all the other classes are, I'm sure, slowing down because of PSAs, but I am ramping up. So here we go. All right, first things first. Some things to remember. Casualties. This is very, very important. Casualties include wounded, missing or captured, and killed. Okay, so casualties are wounded, missing or captured, and killed. A fatality means killed. Okay, so you will see a lot of different numbers sometimes. The Union and the Confederacy are also known as the Federalists. So the federal government is in DC, the Federalists are in the North, or the rebels, the North, and the South. The South's capital was in Richmond. The North's capital remained in DC. So all these battles that we're going to talk about are part of bigger campaigns. So the Battle of Antietam, for example, was part of the Maryland campaign. The 7 Days battles that we'll talk about was part of the Peninsula campaign. And there are also different quote unquote theaters of the war. You will hear them talk about the Western Theater whenever we talk about Grant and Sherman early in the war. And the Western Theater essentially just means the battles that happened over here, so towards the west. Okay. And I'm going to make this bigger because look at all these little explosions here. All of these are the different battles. So most of these are right around in Virginia. Why do you think so many of them were in this area? Well, one of the main reasons why they were all in this area is that essentially war is capture the flag. And the Union wanted to take Richmond, which was right here. And the South wanted to take DC, which is right about here. Now, a lot of people have asked how involved were Abraham Lincoln or his counterpart in the South, Jefferson Davis. They would essentially tell their generals to take Richmond or protect Vicksburg. And how everything else worked out was essentially up to the commanders. So the army is all about hierarchy. So you would have the main generals, like, I'm sorry, I just bumped, like McClellan or like Robert E. Lee. And he would come up with the main strategies along with his other generals. But there were probably hundreds of generals underneath each one of them, depending on where they were. And the armies were also split. So it's not like you would have every single Union soldier fighting at the Battle of Vicksburg or Antietam or Gettysburg. So Vicksburg and Gettysburg actually happen around the same time because the armies were split. But even so, these smaller quote unquote armies still had close to 100,000 men, depending. And because the casualties and the number of people in this war are so high, here's some things I want you to wrap your brains around. So, some details you may need to know. If you don't know what artillery is, here you go. It's big guns, cannons, things like that. To flank someone, if you're watching some videos, you'll talk about so and so outflanking the enemy. It's essentially to sneak behind them and attack from behind. All right. There are hundreds of thousands of casualties by the time the Civil War ends. And sometimes it's really hard for us to imagine thousands of people. So, to give you a point of reference, because I know some of you have been to at least one of these places. So, to put this in perspective, Heinz Field holds about 65,000 people. Okay, that's a lot of people. For those of you that have been there on a Sunday, you know that's a lot of people. Consol Energy Center. So if you've ever been to, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to fix that. It is now PPG Paints Arena. Sorry. If you've ever been to a Penguin game, it holds roughly 20,000. We're just going to call it 20,000. And if any of you have ever made the trek up to Penn State, the Penn State's football stadium holds almost 107,000 people. It is one of the biggest stadiums in the country. It is no longer the biggest, but it is one of, and it is mammoth. Okay. So we're going to use these as reference whenever we start talking about casualties. So in general, what were the soldiers' lives like? Well, they weren't exactly exciting. A lot of the military is wait. 2 to 3 days of absolute panic and disorder and chaos and bloodshed, and then back to waiting and waiting and waiting. Okay, most of these battles if you look at the dates, take place between basically April and August, September, because the armies would winter over in different barracks. Okay, they typically didn't fight in the winter. Okay, so the average Union soldier, and the Union soldiers were blue typically, but it isn't like today where there's genuinely a uniform. Okay, they had uniforms, but especially at the beginning, they would use their militia uniforms, and then for the Confederacy, and as the war progressed, everyone started running out of supplies, so they would just wear whatever they had. So Union soldiers were approximately 26 years old. Most of them were white. They were native-born Americans, although there were a few Europeans who came over to fight. I know there was a couple of Irish brigades or German brigades, things like that. Most of them were Protestants. And a white Union private, so just getting into the military, not an officer, no one of rank, was paid $13 a month. Once they allowed African Americans into the army, because they didn't at first, an African American of the same rank was paid $7 a month until finally in 1864 pay became equal. And approximately 3 million soldiers fought in the Civil War total. The Confederacy, on the other hand, and they typically wore gray. Okay, so this is a Confederacy. The average age is unknown, but by the end of the war, they were drafting any able-bodied male. So to draft somebody into the military is to order them into the military. Both the North and the South instituted drafts, and typically it would start out by only having men, say 20 to 25, and then by the end of the war, they were drafting everyone from 15 to 55, because they were literally running out of able-bodied men. So again, much like the North, the average was white, native-born Protestant, a farmer. Most of them were still farmers in the North too. They were either farmers or factory workers. A Confederate private was paid $11 a month, but often went months without receiving pay. And that $11 did not stretch very well whenever they started really running into their inflation problems. So these two sides are not actually that different. And yes, even though it says that most of them were farmers, people from all occupations fought in the Civil War. Lawyers, tailors, pretty much anybody. And literally every household was affected by this war. A little bit of Civil War weapons. Now, weaponry is changing for those of you that are into that kind of thing. So, up until this point, rifles were called smooth bore, which means that on the inside of the barrel, it's smooth. Okay? And, all right, so I'm going to use a sports analogy. I know how much you love the sports analogies. So, by the time the Civil War comes around, most of these rifles or muskets have grooves on the insides of the barrels. And those grooves would line up with these little lines on the bottom of these bullets. These are called mini balls. Okay, these are the new kinds of bullets that they were using. Whenever, which I know some of you are like, oh, I hate sports, but if you watch football, okay, the quarterback, when he throws a football, it spirals because it's more accurate, okay? So these guns and these new bullets had a better range, they had a better accuracy, and because they had so much more velocity behind them, they didn't just go through, they literally shattered bones if it hit a bone. And that's why there were so many amputations during the Civil War, because today we can pop someone on an x-ray machine and figure out how to put back bones like a puzzle. we were able to wire or put in a plate or something. Back then, they didn't have any of those options, and they were so afraid of infection that um, a lot of times they just amputated because there was nothing they could do to put the bones back together. Sorry to be gross, but we'll get to Civil War medicine in a bit. All right, so artillery, big guns. This is a Gatling gun. This thing is crazy. So, this is literally a hand cranked machine gun. You can see the different barrels, and this could shoot about 200 rounds of bullets in a minute, but it wasn't very accurate. It was effective, don't get me wrong, but it also was known to jam quite frequently because these are still fairly new devices and they hadn't really worked out all the kinks yet. But by the time you get to the Civil War, we have essentially machine guns. And in addition to those, both sides had genuine artillery. So these are cannons, but by the time the Civil War hit, they're guns and mortars. Okay. Their purpose was to fire projectiles and inflict damage to structures and enemy soldiers. And the size and shape determined the range. Okay, so this one is obviously pretty big. You can see the people, people standing next to it. This is huge. So what these two things are, this is the ammo they would use. Okay, some of. So sometimes they would use just straight up solid cannonballs. Okay. Other times they would be more hollow. So this whole canister would get put into the barrel of, a mortar or a cannon or whatever you want to call it. But inside of this are all these little cannonballs. So when this would hit something, it would break open upon impact. And then you would have this spray of little mini cannonballs all over the place. And it inflicted actually a lot more damage depending on what your target was. Same thing with this. So this is all kind of held together by this rod, but again, it would break on impact and would fling all of this shrapnel in every which way. So these are this combined with the background on the North and the South is your background and intro to the Civil War. The next video, we will go through some of the first battles and why the North almost lost the war in 1862. And if you have any questions, any issues, let me know.